Testing. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to day 2 of, or day 3 of the IMGL conference. I trust, like me, you all enjoyed the dinner last night, sponsored by the SAS Group. I think we were very happy to be able to enjoy the sights of the Lübowitz Palace, and thank you very much for participating. I'd like to thank again SAS Group for sponsoring the dinner last night, as well as our other sponsors, CMS, Play and Go, Casino Track, AGM, Foxtrot Austral, Novomatic, BMM, Butler Snow, IGT, and WH Partners. We've got to thank them all for their support for the conference, because as I mentioned yesterday, without them, it wouldn't be a success. We have a very full day today. I trust that you can stay for the entirety of the day, and particularly for the discussion groups this afternoon. And again, please have a look on the website for the topics to be covered by the discussions, so that you're going to be able to participate fully, and we'd very much welcome your participation. I'd like now to introduce Carina Mancini, who's going to be leading the first panel today. I'll ask him to introduce his topic and also to introduce his panel. Thank you, Carina.
Thank you, Jamie. Good morning. I feel very privileged today because I am moderating a panel of, well, 4 out of 4 former regulators. And I think in my long career as a conference speaker, which happens to be my second job, unpaid job, I never had this privilege. So I hope that we will be able to put together some very special talk today, because these guys are now on the other side of the barricade, but they are all coming from the regulatory authorities of their respective countries. So, as you may have guessed by now, even without taking a look at the program, we are going to talk about regulations, how they are handled on both sides of the ocean and elsewhere, and how they should or should not be handled. So, before I start this discussion, I would like to briefly introduce you to my fellow panelists here. We have to my far right Morten Ronde from Denmark. Morten is a former Danish gaming regulator. Next to Morten we have Dan Bourgeois, who is coming from Canada, Ontario, and he was formerly at the Alcohol and Gaming Regulatory Authority in Ontario. Next to Dan, we have Bill Boggart, who is now a partner in an American firm, but formerly was a regulator at the Illinois Gaming Regulatory Board. And then my very good friend Francesco Rodano, last but not least, former Italian regulator. He was the head of the remote gaming operations at the Italian Regulatory Authority. So a very well qualified panel, and I will not waste too much time to let the mic to them. But I would like to start by thanking my Prime Minister and his cabinet for having afforded me this great opportunity to start this panel by quoting them and the very miserable job they did just a few weeks ago when literally overnight or so they decided to push a blanket gambling advertising ban in Italy, which was also briefly, or I would say not briefly, enough covered already at another panel yesterday. it would deserve a conference alone, but we do not have that much time. So I will just use this to introduce the topic and say that this is exactly an example, the case in point of how regulations should not be handled. And I'll tell you why. As you may have, you may be aware that we had general elections in Italy last March. After the elections, the day after, we were basically faced with a deadlock situation. And no party had gained enough consensus to go and rule the country alone. So after 4 full months of bargaining and negotiations between the four-star movement and the League, the two parties that got the biggest consent at the elections, they put together what they call a coalition program, which was a patchwork of the certain bits of the manifesto of the five-star movement and bits and pieces of the manifesto of the League. The five-star movement has always been very vocally opposed to gambling. And in their manifesto, they actually stated that they would eradicate gambling from the Italian society on grounds that they feel this is the biggest problem that the country has, believe it or not. So when they put together this patchwork coalition program, one of the bits that ended up in the program was eradicating, cracking down on gambling. And here we are. When they met at the first cabinet meeting, they decided to, amongst many other measures totally unrelated to gambling, to throw into the package also this initial kick towards the eradication of gambling, which was the gambling ban. So no consultation with the industry, no preparation, no analysis of the market, no nothing, just a very strong message to the constituency that was, see, we are the ones who deliver. We said we would do it, we are doing it. And here we are. So this is exactly what should not happen when it comes to dealing with an industry which is quite important, because if I'm not mistaken, we are talking about an industry that fetches to the state coffers something like 10 billion euros in tax revenues. So when you say, I will eradicate gambling, you also need to take on board that the moment you do that, you have a shortfall in the budget of something like 10 billion. And you need to find alternative sources, which is not that simple in a country that is not booming like Italy, economy-wise. So with all that in mind, I think that my first question will be for Francesco, because Francesco is coming from that office that is now tasked with implementing, although they will not be the authority that will enforce the gambling ban, but still they are the authority that overlooks the gambling business altogether. So I would like to ask Francesco, what was your immediate thought when you heard about this? And if you think, and I should also say that Francesco was at the regulator's office long enough for me to build with him a personal relationship day in, day out. I was talking to him more than to my own kids. And he was very open, not just to me, but also to the rest of the advisors and operators. You could always find a door open rather than closed, and you could put on the table issues, queries, etc., and find some kind of answer, even when the answer was no, but you would still get an answer. Unfortunately, things have since changed quite dramatically, and so I would like to ask him, what is now now that you are on the other side of the barricade, what is your perception of what's going on, if you feel that actually the way, at least in Italy, regulations are dealt with is not quite the right way?
Thank you. Good morning. So when I saw the news about the sudden advertising ban, I thought I knew it. I saw it coming. And it's very easy to explain. It's a political decision which generates very easily consensus among the population. Just one figure. There's been a poll after this decree that asked the Italian people, what do you think of the measures? There were several measures, one of which was advertising ban. And the advertising ban was by far the most popular one. 72% of Italians supported it. So as a government, it was a no-brainer. But there are some lessons to be learned there. When Europe's largest regulated market for gambling decides to ban advertising, there's a signal there. So this happened especially because in Italy there was a huge diffusion of retail slots. At some point in time, we had 500,000 of them, so very visible on the streets, people hooked on them. And this, of course, generated a backlash on the public opinion, and now that there is a populist government, again, it was an easy move. But the irony is that these retail slots operators, who generate 4 billion euros in tax revenues, more than half, and they don't spend a single euro in marketing, so they didn't really care. The other factor was advertising from online operators on TV. Quirino recently counted the number of ads around a single sports event. They were 15, 16, 12 different operators advertising across a single football game. I wonder commercially what's the sense of that. But this, again, distorted the perception about online gambling in general, because it's very visible, and it's more visible than it is relevant in terms of economic contribution, which, by the way, in Italy is just 7%. So, recapping, negative public perception. My wife still thinks that my job is to kill people. And if you ask your friends that are not involved in gambling, probably they could have a similar perception. The retail operators, which are the powerful economic force in Italy and elsewhere, didn't care, so they didn't lobby against the ban. Actually, some of them are celebrating now. And I suspect that all the major online operators, the incumbents, that are already in Italy, now are counting the money they are saving in terms of marketing spend and the marketing staff they are laying off. The fact that advertising is prohibited is a barrier to new entrants, so who's already there might not be so unhappy. And the last point, the real risk, in my opinion, is that this will set an example. There are already signals around. I have a list of countries in which they are discussing restrictions or prohibitions for gambling advertising. In the UK, it's continuously. The tougher restrictions have been announced. And again, it starts with FOBTs, with retail slots, and then it catches everything. In Spain, a new government, socialist government, they're discussing a possible advertising ban, mentioning Italy. Australia, they recently banned advertising during live sports events. Kenya, Ireland, the president of Ireland also declared that he wants to ban advertising during sports events. Even the Socialist Party in Belgium. So there's a risk of a domino effect. Not all the operators are affected, And most importantly, since the topic was the role of regulators, these regulators are useless in this mechanism. They can't influence the political decision. What they can do maybe is to try to educate the public opinion and the politicians by providing figures based on evidence. You mentioned that Italy is going to lose 10 billion euros if gambling gets prohibited as a whole, but there's an easy counter-argument. The Prime Minister said that the social costs linked to gambling in Italy are to 12 billion euros. So if they decide to put to cancel gambling as a whole, on the state budget they will say plus 2 billion euros, because they're going to save 12 billion.
Based on which?
None. That's why there's a lack.
Just a number out of.
Yeah, but now.
Have been 20 billion.
But now the entire population believes that. So that's because maybe someone should provide reliable figures based on research.
Maybe across the ocean, and I am asking Dan and Bill, things are slightly better. There is less bias around gambling, more consultation, more a more, I would say, professional, qualified approach than the one we are seeing on this side of the ocean, at least as far as Italy is concerned. But as Francesco was rightly saying, the risk is that Italy might set a very dangerous precedent that might spread across the Alps. So what's your experience and what's your comment on what you're hearing?
I'll take a stab at answering that. Obviously, we share a lot of the same things. In Italy and the U.S., first of all, there's always a constant battle between the government wants gambling to get the revenue, but at the same time, they generally can't stand gambling because it's a social evil to some people. And that battle continues and moves back and forth. But in the U.S., if something like this happened, first thing we'd have is a court challenge, because that's what we do in the U.S. Just having the sports ban, of course, under federal law in Illinois, as everyone knows, has been overturned. But in the U.S., advertising is a form of free speech, and any effort to try to regulate it or stop it would have a constitutional challenge. But ultimately, this seems very short-sighted, just because gambling, along with prostitution, are two things that have always been with civilization. So we'll never really get rid of it. But one thing that when you told me about what they're doing in Italy, I was really surprised, because at least in Illinois, and where I'm from in the U.S., and most states, regulations are rolled out slower and more thoughtful and have input from the stakeholders. So, just like in my state of Illinois, if a regulator wants to propose regulations, the first step is they can only do a regulation if it's within the confines of the enabling statute that allowed gambling. If there's no mention there, you can't do it. And then regulations go out and they're filed, and it takes about 150 days in my state for a regulation to become law, and it gets 3 filings, and each time it gets input from stakeholders or anyone who can comment on it, and they have hearings on the regulations. And if it makes it through this third-party panel called the Joint Committee of Administrative Regulations, then 150 days later, it can become law. So you really have a very thoughtful process, and when a regulation's first made until it first comes out, it goes through a lot of changes and a lot of vetting, something that I was surprised to learn you guys do not have in Italy whatsoever. So I was very surprised to hear that. But the interesting thing too is just that I think, at least in the U.S., the citizens will probably be just up in arms, just because we historically have a very anti-government perspective on things. So I don't think it would get quite the support it does in Italy. But that's my first thought on the difference. Don, maybe you got something else?
Thank you. First, I'd like to give a little bit of background. I'm former general counsel of the Alcohol and Gaming Commission, which, as indicated, is alcohol and gaming, and soon to be cannabis, according to the public press. the largest regulator in that area in Canada with over 500 people staff, including about 190 Ontario Provincial Police. I mention that because it's part of the context in which regulation occurs in Ontario. I also was a former counsel at some other ministries and agencies in the Government of Ontario and former policy advisor. So from a regulatory perspective, I've seen it from advising cabinet ministers to being the person responsible for ensuring the regulation is administered in accordance with the law as it goes forward. I'd like to step back as well a little bit about government. Governments generally are structured the same way throughout the democratic world. There'll be differences and different approaches. I've found out that for constitutional cases, for individuals in Italy, it's handled a little bit different than in Canada or the United States. But generally, governments are structured in a comparable fashion. And that's a central office, a premier, a president, a prime minister is there in order to lead the government. There are ministerial or departmental officials. There's a central bureaucracy tied to the prime minister, the premier, president, and some others. There's also senior public servants, deputy ministers, undersecretaries, whatever the terminology is. Then ministerial department public servants who provide advice and services up the pike. And then there's agencies such as the AGCO that administer the law. What needs to be understood, and very often from my experience as a lawyer as well as a policy advisor, is that people don't look to what is motivating. Now, we've had a good discussion about what motivated in Italy from a political point of view. We can accept that or reject it, but that was the motivation of Five Star in order to move forward. So unless you understand the motivation of each of these elements in the government, you won't be able to influence the public policy, in my experience. Also, what are their mandates? Is it a political mandate or is it some other type of mandate? How serious are they? Because periodically there are ideas that are brought forward. Some are good, some are bad. They're brought forward, but they're either implemented because someone is a champion and has got it, the bit in their mouth in order to move forward on this. In other cases, it's sort of, well, it was an idea, you told me, it sucks, so I'm not going to go forward with it. There's various. You need to understand what the motivation is, how serious the person is, and where they are. Is it a political or is it a bureaucratic initiative, or both? In Canada, we have a phrase that comes from ice hockey, play the man, not the puck. And that's essentially what the industry needs to do, is start to look at who is doing this, what's their motivation, what's their influence, what's their power, how serious are they, and where are they in that realm of political, public servant, how up in the hierarchy, who do they influence, who is influenced, who influences them in their decision making, etc. Again, it may be an ill-informed political statement, or it may be being a bureaucrat, an ex-bureaucrat, an extraordinarily well thought out idea that comes up from the bureaucracy. You need to understand those things. And that's where the industry, in my experience, consistently fails. Fails to understand the motivation or what is driving it, and how to manage that, and how to deal with the different elements. Because government is not, it's a monopoly, but it is not a monolith. It is a whole bunch of different elements within it that you can sometimes play one off the other, whether it's an economic versus social or whatever. The sector also too often reacts, and I'm not going to comment on the advertising because I think that's probably a unique situation, although there are some background to it. But the sector too often just says, if you do this, you're going to destroy my business. I heard it a number of times. The ministers have heard it a number of times. And once you've heard it 3 or 4 times, it sort of loses the impact. So you have to, as Guillermo indicated, you have to have the facts. You have to understand these things. You're not debating it in the public. You're debating it or having the discussion behind the curtain with individuals, and facts do matter. Most public servants, as I said, we tend to ignore those type of statements because they don't have credibility, quite frankly. The sector also fails very often in engaging with the agencies, ministers on an ongoing basis. And that's why the two of you had a good relationship was because you had a daily contact. You had an engagement with each other. Sometimes you're successful in it, other times you're not. That engagement on an ongoing basis is absolutely crucial. And that's not just with the regulator, it's with the senior public servants in the different ministries that are involved, or with the Premier's office, or elsewhere. It encourages an ongoing open dialogue, but it critically deals with a trust. Can I trust you as a regulator? Can I trust you as a senior public servant? Do we have that type of relationship that I'm willing to be your champion inside? Because if I don't trust you, hey, you're off on your own. The sector itself is often too dysfunctional, and members take a me-only approach rather than a sectoral approach. It's easier to dismiss a group if it's many voices, so flip a coin as to who you're going to listen to, or there's no consistent voice. I want to support a comment that Heathcliff from Malta made yesterday. The industry should deal with the issue before it becomes an issue for the government. And I think that's a critical element. You know it exists, find a solution to it. Now that's not all the time, it's the case of the advertising ban. And finally, my first boss in government when I was a junior policy advisor told me, don't come to me with a problem unless you come to me with a solution. And I think that's the same thing for the industry. Don't come to the government saying we have a problem unless you have a solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Very interesting remarks. Morten, how do you position yourself as a past Danish regulator in this debate? Which side do you feel closer, the Italian approach or the North American one?
Ooh, that's a difficult. What do I feel mostly, as an Italian or a North American? No, so I work today not only as a lawyer but also as a lobbyist, because I represent through a trade body the licensed online operators in Denmark. So I very much support the comments Don just had towards how this is also partly industry's fault. So speaking about the Italian case, it's this is what I would call political intervention more rather than regulatory intervention. I doubt that if you ask the regulators and you could fight with them, I doubt that they would like this this measure. Usually I find also through my experience as a regulator is that you like the platform you have, you develop the platform you have, the system you have in your country, you're not looking to overturn it. So when politicians want to overturn it, they usually do it completely and superseding the regulator. And I think I see that right now in my own country, whereas there was a political agreement struck in July where the politicians agreed on restrictions on marketing. So very much the same topic, not as severe as in Italy, but still severe enough for the industry. And I don't think the regulator was asked about their opinion. So the topic of marketing is something that speaks to politicians. It's an easy topic, something that speaks to your heart. And that's the way politics work. And I don't think anyone ever accused politicians of being rational. They work in a bit of an irrational, emotional way. And this is an easy topic. And of course, when Francesco says the marketing ban was popular in Italy, I mean, that's a no-brainer. If I ask any person, do you like gambling adverts? No, they don't. Do you think they should be banned? Of course they do. So it's a populist movement where you would hope that the politicians, once they have agreed, it should be restricted or it should be banned, they would think, but there are also other reasons why we should maintain sort of some advertising because it benefits the country. Maybe there would be no competition. Maybe the black market would then grow again. And there, I think, it's the industry's fault that that doesn't seem to be any understanding with the politicians where they have this second thought that, okay, hey, maybe we should consult with the industry. Maybe there is another way. Maybe there's a golden middle way. And it's two things. You pointed to it, I think, is that the industry has not been very good at working together with a sort of consistent PR approach. Operators, they speak for themselves. They are happy to pride themselves with how good we are, and they fail to cooperate and have a consistent approach and dialogue with politicians. And secondly, and I think somebody pointed to that yesterday, secondly, industry has not been good enough recently to be compliant. So there's a burning platform. So these two things combined makes way of political interventions, and that is difficult when it's there on the table and there's no dialogue, there's no understanding. Something like this occurs.
So, based on what I've been hearing so far, it would seem that the first and biggest accountable persons or people for what's happening in Italy and might be soon happening elsewhere, certainly in Europe, more difficult across the ocean. But what could become a very dangerous precedent, I defend it, is the industry itself. The industry that hasn't smelled the coffee soon enough, hasn't done, and this is something that we have seen, and I'm sure that Morten has witnessed it even better than me. We have seen over time, even in the rest of Europe, how many times the industry and in which occasions the industry, be it the Italian industry, the English, the British industry, the French industry, how many times were they able to get together and agree on something which could only just be 2-3 bullet points. This is what we all have in common. This is a common interest for the industry. This is what we want to prevent from happening, and this is how we want to reach out to our own regulators, to the market, to the public opinion, and so on and so forth. I've been in this business for close to 20 years, and I still have to see one single case where, be it Rome, London, or elsewhere, there was this kind of cohesion, coherent and consistent action. This is lack of lobbying, but even more so, lack of communication. And this is very dangerous because when we hear that regulators are little more than just executioners of what the politicians, the ministry, and the cabinet decide to bring about, it becomes even more crucial for the industry to prevent the worst from happening, to prevent that kind of wrong motivation that Dan was making reference to before, by taking some preemptive action, by doing something in advance. And this is completely lacking. I don't know whether your perception is my perception, but certainly on this side of the ocean, we haven't seen, talking about lobbying, talking about communication, talking about a sound way for the industry to reach out to their customers. We have never seen something like that. How many times have we seen the industry take a common initiative and pool money for a just cause, for some good causes? This is mostly and mainly a voluntary effort, which is done individually, but not collectively. So do you think that my understanding is what is actually happening also in your jurisdictions? Maybe let's start with Francesco, because he probably understands exactly where I'm coming from on this.
No, I completely agree. A few years ago, I had a meeting with the trade association of gambling operators in Italy, and I literally implored them to work on a self-regulatory code for advertising, because that backlash was already starting. So I told them, please limit yourself, agree on something that among you that would make this advertising less strong and impactful. And they started meeting among them, and after months they came back and said, we couldn't. We can't agree on a single point. There's, I think it's normal. There's competition, fierce competition, especially in the online gambling sector for market share. That's why a regulatory intervention is actually needed. Because if, that's something that's happening in this moment in the UK, where the UK Gambling Commission is urging the operators to be more socially responsible. And behind the definition, there's a lot of stuff. I think, and this is annoying the operators, so to speak, because there are fines, and then because the operators must invest on that and distracting attention from commercial activities. But I suspect that the Commission in the UK is doing that exactly to avoid a possible negative political decision in the future, like it happened in Italy. You mentioned that in Illinois there's a consultation over new regulations, but then if someday George Bush comes and decides that gambling should be banned as a whole, all the Illinois regulations would be useless at that point. There's always a possible political decision that trumps, everything.
Dirty word. Yeah, well, and, that's a perfect segue to really what is regulatory intervention, I guess, politically, because, when I first thought of the phrase, regulatory intervention, I think of a usurpation of democracy, because we're not supposed to have bureaucrats making law and waking up one day and changing the law. Ultimately, we should have statutes that are voted upon by Parliament or Congress or state governments, and anytime you wake up one day, there's a sudden shift in law that's done by a regulatory body. To me, that usurps the entire purpose of democracy, and that's something that we should fight against. And hopefully we get trade associations to work together, like you were saying. But I've had the same experience with trade associations in the U.S. They're little political bodies, and to get the associations together to try to agree on something and then work with the regulators to implement that policy is often just as challenging as dealing with our elected officials. And it would be nice to see us come together on a couple things and try to work, and that's another continual challenge. But ultimately, at least, and maybe it's just a U.S. lens. But every time, like again, the democratic process should definitely be from the people electing folks who pass laws, and anything that the regulators decide to unilaterally impose seems like the wrong perspective to me, and at least I know that we're pretty sensitive to it in the U.S., which is why we have so many court cases.
I want to follow up on Bill's comment about it as well, because it's something that I agree with. There's sort of an implicit agreement between the political arm of government and the bureaucratic arm of government. You create an agency like the AGCO or some of the others so that it's an arm's length from government. And the deal is, we will ensure to the best of our ability that the political arm of government does not get embarrassed. That we will deal with those issues to the best that we can, given the resources. So you have to resource us. You have to help us protect your political side of things and allow an industry to develop and to prosper, to be responsible, et cetera, have integrity, and all the rest of it. The other implicit part of that, and this is where the theory of democracy fits in, is that you can give us policy direction, general direction as to what we're to look at under the statute and the regulations. You can overrule our decision by regulation if you want to, etc. But you will not interfere in decisions related to licensees, registrants, or something of that nature. So when it's getting to an individual or business's rights and obligations, you keep your nose out of that. That's our business, not yours. The general policy side of things, that's your business. We can help you, we can try and influence you, we can advise you, etc., but that's your decision making. And I think that is ultimately, there are regulations that were brought down, policies. Personally, I thought were stupid. Sometimes I was right, sometimes I was wrong. But my job was to implement those policies to the best of my ability. And I think that's the situation. Can I help? And I think this is my final comment on that, is look to the regulators not to make the decisions, but if the regulator trusts you and you've developed that relationship with them and you have a credible trade association, you can use the regulator to help start to influence those policy decisions in the long run. Because generally government doesn't say, we've been told by the regulator what we're going to do is absolutely stupid, but we're going to do it anyways. So over a period of time, you can start to influence policy through a regulator if you have a strong working relationship with that regulator.
Would you agree with that remark?
Yeah, and I want to say, when we're speaking, especially when you're speaking in Europe, most government regulators are not independent. They're actually politically controlled. So quite often here in like Eastern Europe, the regulator is part of the Ministry of Finance. So it's directly politically controlled. So you have actually, so when you have access to the regulator, you also have access to the minister and the government. So you have to as an industry work with the regulator and see if you can keep the discussions at that level. Because the problem is that when it gets at a political level, you roll the dice and you simply don't know what is gonna happen. So I absolutely agree, and it's as much about taking initiatives as an industry yourself to maintain to maintain the situation so it doesn't evolve into this political game.
We are just at the end of our panel. Before I wrap it up, I would like to know if there are any questions from the floor. Steve, please.
Thanks. Francesco, you mentioned you just alluded to the British Gambling Commission being very active on enforcement, and you will probably be aware of that. And you know, they've set out their enforcement strategy about a year ago, and they're now coming through with that. And it's a very active interventionist, if you will, and it's creating a bit of kind of a culture of fear in the industry. But I think their clear strategy is to heavily enforce in an increasingly dramatic way to get people to comply. I'm interested for all of you as to when you were regulators, what was your strategy to get people to comply? And now that you're no longer regulators, do you think that was the right strategy?
So let me comment, because I looked at that enforcement strategy, and this may not be the approach you want, in preparation for a gaming class I provide involved in Ontario. And I thought the UK Gambling Commission's enforcement strategy was an excellent strategy. So, and why? Because there are issues there. And so as a regulator and former regulator, it lays it out so that you know as an industry what is going to happen. If you do X, this is the result. And it is also a graduated one. It is not a hanging offense to do something, but it becomes a hanging offense if you do it enough or you don't start to take measures to correct the problem. And so looking at it, and I looked at it for quite a bit, I thought it was a good strategy. And it's certainly one that I would encourage regulators to put in place because it also enhances the confidence the public has in the gaming industry. If the public knows or has access to information about what happens and why it happens, that enhances the credibility of the regulatory structure, which helps to enhance the confidence in the sector itself.
Yeah, and I can give some examples of my home state of Illinois. When I was a regulator, I like to think I did a pretty good job, but obviously I'm reformed now. But back about 10 years ago when I was with the Illinois Gaming Board, oftentimes if we had a shift in policy or something, we try to have meetings, get all the stakeholders together and actually try to craft policies together, directions, find the right answer. Over the years at that body, things have changed, and just as recently as last week, I was talking to a regulator asking, well, what should we do? What's your position on this? And I was told that, well, we haven't formulated it now, but when we file a disciplinary complaint to take away someone's license, then the industry will know. And I probably heard that answer several times in the last couple of weeks, which is like some form of gotcha regulation. We're not going to tell you what the policy is, but you'll know when someone gets hung, which just seems ludicrous to me, that that's the way some regulators feel. Hopefully that'll change, but we'll see.
My way to do enforcement with my licensees was to just talk to them and say, please. I was very polite, so to speak. Because the Italian legal system doesn't provide for huge sanctions or other instruments, my solution was to establish a good relationship with all of them and try to discuss things, and then it mostly worked.
Okay, I think, Morten, unless you have any more additional comments to add, we can wrap it up here. And I would like to thank my fellow panelists here and ask you to give them a well-deserved round of applause, because it's been a very interesting. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Carino. That was a super panel for the first session of today, and really starts us on the right track for the remainder of the day. So please join me again in thanking Carino and his panel. I'd now like to call the next panel up to the podium, please, to be led by Cosmina Simion. While we're just waiting for the panel to assemble, perhaps those of you for whom this is your first conference, would you just, first IMGL conference, please just raise your hands, because I think it's just important that you're known and that you can be the rest of the members. So anyone for whom it's the first IMGL conference, please raise your hands. Okay, well look, I think for each of those, please take note. For those of us who are veterans of IMGL conferences, I think it's appropriate for us to engage, make sure that all of the new attendees understand more about IMGL, and we receive feedback. But generally, there's going to be the ability to provide feedback. But thank you very much for coming to the IMGL conference. It's great to have you here, and of course, we hope to see you at future conferences. Let me now pass you on to Cosmina and the panel about social responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you for being here with us. I'm going to introduce the panel. I have Jessica Meyer from Melchers. Jessica is a German attorney and advises clients on all aspects of gaming law with a focus on regulation, licensing, and compliance. She has provided guidance to clients in various licensing proceedings, and this includes developing strategies for the implementation of new products on the German market. And she's also experienced in lobbying and regularly contributes to gambling law and industry publications. She's also a member of IAGA and Global Gaming Women. David McLeish, next to me, he's a partner with Wigan in the UK, where he advises on a broad range of corporate, commercial, and regulatory matters, as well as providing general strategic advice to a broad range of industry participants. David's practice has had a gambling focus for over 10 years, and prior to joining Wigan, he has spent 4 years as the general counsel of one of the industry's largest software suppliers. Sebastian Blum, he's the global head of corporate and legal affairs with Zeal Network. He's a corporate affairs professional with substantial knowledge in the areas of public affairs, corporate communication, legal affairs, and business development. He has a strong track record in highly regulated digital and disruptive industries, and he also had leading roles in the international strategy rollouts and department setups throughout Europe and the USA. And last but not least, Andrew Zammit. He's the managing partner of GVZH Advocates, a top-tier law firm based in Malta. The firm offers a full spectrum of services, including all corporate and regulatory matters, corporate company registrations, and the review of gaming license applications, and ongoing support for operators who establish their operations in Malta. So thank you for joining me for our discussions today. We are we sit at the core of this business from my perspective, as the players are the one who we are dependent on. So while the industry thrives in adjusting to the ever so new technologies and to address the everlasting need for entertainment of its consumers, need not to forget their well-being from a social perspective, if not even more. The regulatory intervention panel earlier this morning has also touched upon some of these subjects, as changes in the laws always trail changes in the society. So over the last century, many products and services have gone to the evil end. I will talk about tobacco, for example, which stands out. But while smoking has gone one way, gambling has gone the other way. In the 1950s, gaming was clearly considered a commercial category of a vice, forbidden or at least significantly restricted in many ways, and also associated with other condemned activities, both legally, socially, morally. But laws and regulations have turned black into white. The explosion of legal gambling has turned the view that gambling is merely another form of entertainment. Still, while in their vast majority gamblers are entertained, need not to forget that for some, amusement turns into compulsive gambling. The American Psychiatric Association speaks about pathological gambling. The World Health Organization defines the gaming disorder. Now, we can all agree that these are extreme situations. The vast majority of us do not need to stop enjoying red wines in order not to become alcoholics. Even such health organizations represent that in order for a mere entertainment to turn into a disorder, the change in behavior needs to be severe, evident, affect the social life, family, education, occupation, or any other areas of daily functioning for at least 12 months. What do we do in order not to get to such stage? Public institutions, be them regulators or health bodies and private operators alike, have now an understanding that for better or worse, players need to be protected. In order to do so, we need to understand behaviors and we need to understand interaction with individual gambling products. So this panel will address social challenges in the industry today. How does it react to those? And how does it do things better? To start with, I will ask the panel, how do they view millennials and how do they behave compared to their predecessors? Jessica?
Good morning, everybody. I think, well, first of all, millennials are young. That's what comes to mind first. But in terms of gaming behavior, I think the main aspect that really makes a difference to older generations is the online factor and mobile gaming, which are important, both important to millennials. The sort of accessibility of games, being able to play spontaneously, impulsively, just when you feel like gaming, maybe even shorter sessions. I think that's something very typical for millennials. Also, studies have shown that it tends to be, or millennials tend to be less risk averse, or that they are risk averse, and have are more interested in other aspects such as the entertainment factor or the social experience that comes with gambling, so everything that surrounds it. I think that's something obviously operators need to bear in mind when they're sort of talking to their customer, communicating with their customers, and also when it comes to how an operator can be responsible and have know their customer in that sense. What I think is also very typical for millennials is that that's again where this risk-averse approach comes in. That the games tend to include more skill elements to give the impression that you can beat the game rather than have to rely on luck, and I think that's we see that in how popular or how a shift in which games are popular. For example, lotteries are just probably too slow moving. You can play once a week, you have no or twice maybe, and it doesn't really go with the lifestyle. And I think this sort of incorporating gambling into normal life as a means of entertainment and distraction. I think that's typical for millennials.
Well, you touched upon the lottery, so I turn my gaze to Sebastian. What games tend to be more appealing than others?
Yeah, basically I wrote down 4, I would say, criteria which are linked to millennials, which is instant satisfaction and response, some need to share experience, then entertainment, very important, and kind of a permanent seek of innovation, so something new. And when you look at these 4 items, it becomes obvious that they are right at the front